In the heart of New Orleans, where jazz music fills the air and echoes through the vibrant streets, a rising star is lost under mysterious circumstances. Malik Turner, a gifted saxophonist known for his soulful melodies, was found dead behind the famous jazz nightclub, the Crescent. Just hours earlier, he had played a sold-out performance, electrifying the crowd with his extraordinary talent. But by morning, he was gone, his life snuffed out in the shadows of the very place that had celebrated his rise. What happened to Malik Turner that night? The jazz community, once filled with admiration for his talent, now reels from his sudden, violent death. Was it the result of a random act of violence, or was there something more sinister behind it? In a city where music and danger often mix, his death raises unsettling questions. As the investigation unfolds, the spotlight falls on Malik's best friend and drummer, Rico, who becomes the prime suspect. But the truth turns out to be far more complicated. Beneath the surface, a tangled web of jealousy, betrayal, and criminal connections lurks, threatening to unravel everything Malik and his bandmates worked for. The deeper the detectives dig, the more they realize this murder may be connected to a decades-old mystery, one that may hold the key to unlocking the truth about Malik's death. Malik Turner's life had always been shaped by his love for jazz. Born and raised in New Orleans, a city where the sound of brass and strings could be heard from every street corner, Malik was destined to be part of its musical legacy. By the time he was in his 20s, his raw talent had earned him a reputation as one of the most promising saxophonists of his generation. With a sound that was both smooth and soulful, he quickly became a fixture in the city's jazz scene, drawing the attention of both audiences and industry insiders. But it wasn't just his music that made Malik special. It was his unwavering commitment to authenticity. In a world often tainted by shortcuts and compromises, Malik refused to play anything but his truth. His performances were more than just shows. They were expressions of his soul, leaving every listener in awe. Yet, despite the acclaim, Malik was not immune to the darker side of the industry. Behind the glitz and glamour, the world of jazz was filled with rivalries, hidden agendas, and dangerous alliances that often went unspoken. At the heart of Malik's journey was his deep bond with his best friend, Rico, who had been by his side since their early days playing together in local clubs. The two shared more than just music, they shared a dream. But in the competitive world they inhabited, that dream came with a price. As Malik's star began to rise, so did tensions within the circle of friends and business partners. This tragic story is not just about the loss of a gifted musician. It is about the price of ambition, loyalty, and the dangerous world lurking behind the music scene. To continue following the investigation into Malik's death, the unraveling of his tangled relationships, and the shocking twists that await, subscribe to Beyond the Evidence. Malik Turner and Rico had been inseparable for years, bound by both a deep friendship and a shared love for music. From their early days performing in small jazz clubs in New Orleans to playing in front of sold-out crowds, they had faced every challenge together. The duo's chemistry on stage was undeniable. Malik's saxophone, smooth and emotive, complementing Rico's rhythmic drumming. The connection between them went beyond music. It was a brotherhood, one built on trust and mutual respect. But as Malik's career began to soar, the undercurrent of competition started to strain their bond. The spotlight that had once been shared now fell almost exclusively on Malik. And while Rico was happy for his friend, it was hard to ignore the growing sense of resentment that brewed in the background. Despite being Malik's best friend and a key player in his success, Rico often found himself in the shadow of Malik's fame. It wasn't that Rico didn't have talent. His drumming had helped define the band's sound, but it was Malik who became the face of their music. In an industry driven by ego and ambition, it was difficult not to feel overlooked, even by someone as close as Malik. As Malik's name became more recognized in the jazz world, the pressures mounted. There were whispers about his growing involvement with high-profile promoters, some of whom had questionable connections to the criminal underworld. These new alliances were a point of contention between the two friends. Rico, a more cautious and down-to-earth individual, was uneasy about the direction Malik's career was heading. He saw the music business for what it was, a system full of people who would use you for their own gain, and Malik, in his drive to succeed, seemed to be getting swept up in it all. In this world of rising stars and fleeting loyalties, it wasn't just the music that was at stake. It was the very nature of their friendship. As the pressure mounted, their relationship became increasingly strained. Malik, it seemed, was caught up in a whirlwind of success and ambition, while Rico remained grounded, struggling with the weight of the choices he'd made in his own life. In many ways, they had grown apart, even as they continued to share the same stage. Yet, despite the growing tensions, there was no denying the bond they had. Rico still considered Malik his brother, even though the unspoken jealousy and frustrations were slowly consuming him. The night of Malik's final performance would be the ultimate test of their friendship, and what followed would leave everyone questioning just how deep the divides between them had really gone. As the night of Malik Turner's final performance unfolded, there were already signs that things were not right. The atmosphere at the Crescent nightclub was electric, with a full house of eager fans awaiting the performance of the rising saxophonist. But beneath the lively chatter and clinking glasses, there was an undercurrent of tension. Malik had recently signed a high-profile music contract, one that promised him fame and fortune, but also entangled him with powerful figures who were anything but benevolent. Some within his circle, including Rico, had expressed concerns about these new connections, but Malik, ever the optimist, believed this was his chance to make it big, to take his music to the next level. Behind the scenes, however, whispers of discontent were growing louder. The promoters Malik had aligned himself with were known for their ties to the city's darker elements, gang-linked figures who often mixed business with criminal dealings. Rico, who had always kept a low profile, found himself increasingly uncomfortable with Malik's new circle. He had heard rumors of shady transactions and had even witnessed a heated exchange between Malik and one of the promoters just a week before the performance. But in the competitive world of jazz, loyalty was a rare commodity, and Rico remained silent, hoping his concerns were unfounded. On the night of the performance, the tension was palpable. Malik seemed distracted, not quite his usual self. He was visibly agitated backstage, repeatedly checking his phone and avoiding eye contact with the band members. Rico, who was already feeling the strain of their friendship, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He watched as Malik's interactions with the club's promoters grew increasingly cold and distant. The once unbreakable connection between the two friends was now marked by unspoken frustration and unresolved issues. But it wasn't just Rico who noticed the change in Malik. Several members of the band had mentioned that he seemed more withdrawn, preoccupied with something far beyond the music. Some attributed it to the pressure of his newfound success, while others speculated that the weight of his recent decisions was beginning to take its toll. After the performance, the mood backstage grew even more tense. Malik's usual post-show exuberance was absent. He was quieter than ever, his thoughts seemingly consumed by something much darker. As the band members mingled with fans and the club's patrons, Malik slipped away unnoticed, stepping outside into the alley behind the club. It was here that he would meet his tragic end. The detectives later learned that Malik had been seen talking to someone just moments before his body was discovered, someone who was tied to the very world Malik had tried to leave behind. As the investigation would later reveal, this was the moment the warning signs became undeniable. Malik's increasing isolation, his secretive dealings with unsavory characters, and his growing estrangement from the people who cared about him all pointed to the tragic conclusion that was fast approaching. But no one could have predicted that the night would end in murder, not even those closest to him. The early warning signs had been there, but they were buried under the weight of ambition, ego, and the desire for success. In the end, Malik's choices, his trust in the wrong people, and his detachment from the friends who truly knew him, had set the stage for his untimely death. The discovery of Malik Turner's body behind the Crescent nightclub was as shocking as it was tragic. It was around 3 a.m. when a passerby noticed the lifeless figure sprawled in the dimly lit alley. The police were immediately alerted, and by the time detectives arrived, the scene was already filled with flashing lights and murmurs of disbelief. Malik, the talented saxophonist who had brought so much joy to the city, was now gone. His body, cold and still, seemed out of place in the very city that had once embraced him with open arms. The initial assumption was that Malik had suffered a robbery gone wrong, a possibility that could explain the violence of the crime. But as the detectives began to examine the scene, something didn't add up. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of theft, and no obvious physical injuries that could indicate a mugging. Instead, Malik's body was positioned in a way that suggested something far more deliberate. His clothing was undisturbed, his saxophone nowhere to be found, but there were small traces of blood near his mouth, an indication that his death might not have been as straightforward as it first appeared. As investigators scoured the area for clues, they began to piece together a disturbing picture. Witnesses recalled seeing Malik leave the club shortly after his performance, visibly distracted, but still relatively calm. No one had seen him interact with anyone suspicious, but there was one detail that stood out. A man had been seen standing at the edge of the alley, his back turned, almost as if he were waiting. It wasn't until later that investigators learned that this figure was connected to the very world Malik had recently become entangled with, the dangerous, criminal underworld of the music business. The prime suspect quickly emerged, Rico, Malik's best friend and drummer. A few hours after Malik's body was discovered, Rico was found at his apartment, visibly distraught but suspiciously evasive when questioned about his whereabouts the previous night. His initial statements didn't align with the timeline of Malik's death, and his nervous behavior only raised further questions. To make matters worse, Rico had been seen near the alley behind the crescent not long before Malik's body was found. While there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime, the detectives couldn't ignore the circumstantial evidence that seemed to suggest a connection. The investigation took a darker turn as the detectives delved deeper into the circumstances surrounding Malik's rise to fame. They uncovered Malik's involvement with a powerful group of promoters, some of whom had well-established ties to organized crime. These individuals were known for their ruthlessness, using their influence to manipulate up-and-coming artists into making dangerous deals. Malik's decision to sign a controversial contract with one of these promoters was seen by many as a turning point, a moment when he entered a world far darker than he had anticipated. The tension between Malik's success and his increasing association with these dangerous figures had undoubtedly strained his relationships, but could have pushed Rico, his lifelong friend, over the edge. The detectives learned that Rico had recently confronted Malik about his dealings with these promoters. Rumors of their falling out began to surface, with some suggesting that Rico had become bitter over the changes he saw in Malik. Jealousy, anger, and frustration had been simmering beneath the surface of their friendship for months, and now the unthinkable had happened. The possibility that Rico, overwhelmed by the pressure and his own feelings of betrayal, might have been involved in Malik's death couldn't be ruled out. However, the deeper the investigation went, the more complicated the case became. It wasn't just about a friendship gone wrong. It was about a young man caught in the dangerous web of ambition, corruption, and criminal influence. As detectives continued to probe the murky underbelly of New Orleans' jazz scene, they uncovered more players in Malik's tragic end. Individuals whose motives remained hidden, yet whose actions might have played a pivotal role in Malik's death. Malik's world was no longer just about music. It was about survival, betrayal, and the kind of people who would stop at nothing to maintain control over their empire. What was initially a question of whether his death was a result of an unfortunate altercation now seemed like the first chapter of a far darker story. As the investigation escalated, the detectives realized they were not simply solving a murder. They were uncovering a legacy of greed, power, and manipulation that had ensnared Malik long before the night he died. The news of Malik Turner's death spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the New Orleans jazz community. His friends, colleagues, and fans were left grappling with disbelief. Malik was more than just a musician. He was a symbol of the city's vibrant music scene, a beacon of hope for the next generation of jazz artists. To many, he was a friend, a mentor, and a shining star in an industry that often felt like a battle for survival. His murder, especially under such mysterious circumstances, left a gaping void. Rico, Malik's best friend and the drummer in his band, was the first to feel the brunt of public suspicion. As news outlets began to report that he was the prime suspect, the pressure mounted. The bond between him and Malik had been well known, and to have that same relationship suddenly called into question was nothing short of devastating. Rico's grief was palpable, yet it was overshadowed by the growing suspicion surrounding him. Many in the community wondered how someone so close to Malik could have been involved in such a violent act. Was it jealousy that pushed him over the edge, or was there something more? Despite his emotional distress, Rico's actions did little to ease the suspicions. He became increasingly evasive, refusing to cooperate with the authorities at first, further fueling rumors about his involvement. His answers to investigators seemed inconsistent, and he was seen isolating himself from others, retreating into the silence of his apartment or the solitude of the back rooms at the club. In the eyes of the public, this only added to his guilt. The sense of betrayal felt by those closest to Malik was palpable. How could someone who had shared so much of his life, his passion for music, and his dreams of success, possibly take those things away so violently? Malik's family, too, struggled to come to terms with the loss. His parents, devastated by the sudden and senseless murder of their son, were left asking the same questions as everyone else. What had happened to Malik in the days leading up to his death? How had he gotten caught up in a world of dangerous individuals that no one had known about until it was too late? The pain of losing a child is unbearable, but the added complexity of the circumstances surrounding Malik's death made it even harder to navigate. His parents, once proud of his success, now found themselves haunted by the choices he had made, though they refused to believe that his death was the result of his own actions. As the community tried to make sense of Malik's tragic death, rumors swirled about his connections to gang-affiliated promoters and criminal figures in the city's music scene. Malik's once promising future now seemed to be tainted by his entanglement with people who had motives far darker than anyone had anticipated. His fans, who had adored him for his talent and charisma, struggled to reconcile the image of the young man they had cheered for with the murky reality that was beginning to surface. Many questioned whether Malik had known the risks he was taking by signing the controversial contract, and whether those decisions had played a role in his untimely end. The public reaction to Malik's death was not limited to those who knew him personally. The jazz community, which had long been a family of sorts, found itself divided. Some rallied around Rico, insisting that he was not capable of such violence, while others wondered if his frustrations with Malik's rise to fame had been the final straw. The speculation about what had truly happened began to spiral, creating a rift within the very group of people who had once supported Malik's career. With the media painting Rico as the prime suspect, and the growing sense of betrayal felt by those who knew him, it became clear that Malik's death was not only a personal tragedy. It was a wound in the very fabric of the New Orleans jazz scene. In the wake of the murder, the investigation deepened. But as detectives pieced together more evidence, they realized that this wasn't just a story of one man's death. It was a story of ambition, betrayal, and a system of power that had been hidden beneath the jazz music Malik loved so dearly. as more details emerged, the lines between friend and foe, between loyalty and betrayal, became ever more blurred. As the investigation into Malik Turner's death progressed, the case became increasingly complex. What had initially seemed like a straightforward murder now appeared to be something much more layered and elusive. Detectives had their work cut out for them. The evidence surrounding Malik's death was scarce, and each lead seemed to raise more questions than answers. However, as they dug deeper, new revelations began to emerge, shedding light on the shadowy world Malik had entered and uncovering connections that no one could have anticipated. The first breakthrough came when the detectives started to examine Malik's recent dealings with the promoters he had become involved with. These individuals, once seen as legitimate figures in the New Orleans music scene, had darker ties that went beyond business. Some were known to have connections to organized crime, using their influence in the music industry as a front for illicit activities. The detectives learned that Malik had recently signed a lucrative contract with one of these promoters, a decision that had come with its own set of risks. While Malik had been excited about the opportunity, the deal was far from innocent. It was structured in a way that placed Malik at the mercy of these powerful figures, who had much more than just business interests in mind. What appeared to be a simple professional opportunity for Malik was actually a trap, one that involved money laundering, shady dealings, and dangerous power dynamics within the club scene. As the detectives pieced this information together, they began to suspect that Malik's murder wasn't just a result of personal betrayal. It was likely tied to the criminal network he had unknowingly become entangled with. His death may have been an attempt to send a message, or worse, a calculated way of silencing someone who had become too difficult to control. The detectives also started to take a closer look at the club where Malik's last performance had taken place. The Crescent, once a staple of the New Orleans jazz scene, was more than just a venue. It was a hub of activity for those operating in the darker corners of the industry. Interviews with club employees revealed that there were several unexplained interactions taking place in the weeks leading up to Malik's death. Staff members recalled seeing Malik meeting with unfamiliar figures in the back rooms, men who were clearly not there for the music. One particular individual, a man with a reputation for making deals with musicians in exchange for protection, had been seen speaking with Malik just days before the performance. This man, it seemed, was linked to the very people who had a vested interest in controlling the New Orleans jazz scene. As the investigation continued, the connection between Malik's murder and an unsolved case from decades earlier came to light. The detectives uncovered a chilling piece of history. Another musician, a local jazz legend, had been found dead in a similar manner behind the Crescent many years before. The circumstances surrounding that death were never fully understood, but now, with Malik's case, the similarities were undeniable. Both musicians had been on the verge of major success. Both had come into contact with the same criminal figures, and both had died under mysterious circumstances. It was as if history had repeated itself, and Malik's death was not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger pattern. This discovery sent the investigation into a new direction. The detectives now had to consider whether Malik's death was merely a consequence of his involvement with dangerous people, or whether it was part of a deeper conspiracy within the city's music scene, one that had been operating for decades, manipulating artists and using them as pawns in a dangerous game of control and power. As they connected the dots between the two murders, the detectives realized that they were dealing with something far more significant than a single murder. They were uncovering a system that had exploited countless musicians, using them to enrich those at the top, and disposing of anyone who threatened to upset the delicate balance. One of the most shocking revelations came when it was discovered that Malik's contract with the promoters was more than just a business agreement. It was part of a much larger scheme to launder money through the music industry. The promoters, under the guise of helping Malik advance his career, had actually been using him as a front for their illegal activities. This fact left the detectives with more questions than answers. Had Malik known what he was getting involved in? Had he been aware of the dangerous people he was dealing with? Or had he been blinded by the allure of fame and success? And most importantly, who among those closest to Malik had known the truth? As the detectives pressed forward with their investigation, they began to focus on the people who had been closest to Malik, particularly Rico. Despite the mounting suspicion surrounding him, there was something about the case that didn't add up. Rico's initial evasiveness had been troubling, but his deep grief over Malik's death suggested he was struggling with more than just guilt. The detectives started to entertain the idea that Rico might not have been the perpetrator, but rather another victim caught up in a world far beyond his control. Rico's relationship with Malik, as complicated as it had become, did not fit the profile of someone capable of committing such a violent crime. The case was now at a crossroads. With the discovery of these deeper connections and the realization that Malik's death was part of a much larger web of corruption, the investigation shifted. The detectives had to dig even deeper, not just into the lives of those directly involved with Malik, but into the system that had allowed this exploitation to continue unchecked for years. In doing so, they would uncover the true depth of the conspiracy, a conspiracy that perhaps had claimed Malik Turner's life, but might ultimately bring down a network of powerful criminals who had long operated in the shadows. The aftermath of Malik Turner's death reverberated through every corner of New Orleans. His murder, which had begun as a tragic loss, quickly grew into a story of corruption, betrayal, and a devastating wake-up call for the city's music scene. For those who had known Malik, the weight of the investigation's revelations was unbearable. They were left not only to mourn the loss of a talented and promising young man, but also to grapple with the uncomfortable truths that had been uncovered about the world he had been a part of. Rico, once Malik's best friend, was now a broken man, caught between grief and guilt. While the detectives ultimately cleared his name of any direct involvement in Malik's murder, the damage to his reputation and emotional state was irreversible. the public suspicions, his own inner turmoil, and the deep rift in his relationship with Malik had left him adrift, unsure of where to turn. His involvement in the investigation had further estranged him from the very community he had once been a part of. Even as his innocence was eventually proven, the bitter realization that his friend had been pulled into a world of dangerous, criminal forces weighed heavily on him. Rico had always known the risks of the music industry, but he had never fully understood how perilous those risks could be. Now, as he stood at the ruins of his own life, he wondered if there had been any way to save Malik from the same fate. For Malik's family, the pain was twofold. The loss of a beloved son, brother, and friend was compounded by the knowledge that his death had been tied to a complex web of crime and manipulation. His parents were left to mourn the bright future that had been stolen from them, but also to face the grim reality that Malik's ambition had unknowingly led him down a dangerous path. They had always encouraged his dreams of success, but now they were forced to reckon with the idea that the very forces they had not understood, those who had seemed like legitimate business people, had been the ones who had orchestrated his downfall. Their son had been a victim, not just of violence, but of a system that exploited young, talented individuals and discarded them when they were no longer useful. As for the New Orleans jazz scene, the impact of Malik's death was deeply felt. What had once been a community united by music now found itself divided, its darker undercurrents laid bare for all to see. Artists and fans alike were left questioning the authenticity of the industry they had once revered. The system of exploitation that had enabled criminals to use musicians as pawns was exposed, but it had been operating in the shadows for so long that many had turned a blind eye. Now, as the truth came to light, the shock waves rippled through the industry, leaving everyone to reconsider the price of fame, success, and ambition. Malik's story was not just his own. It was a cautionary tale for every artist who dreamed of making it big, a warning of the dangers lurking behind the glittering facade of success. In the end, Malik Turner's death, though tragic, was not in vain. The investigation into his murder helped expose a system of corruption that had plagued the music industry for years, shining a light on the dark side of the business. Though the justice that Malik and his family deserved came too late, his story became a turning point for New Orleans' music scene, a scene that perhaps would now be more aware of the hidden dangers that accompanied the pursuit of fame.